Following the death of Fidel Castro, it's perhaps a good time to think about the malign impacts of totalitarian government and the damage that political agendas can do to science. I was recently discussing the Russian biologist Lysenko with a friend, as you do, and naturally we turned to Wikipedia to clarify a point. And I came across a quote that hit me between the eyes, figuratively speaking. The term Lysenkoism can also be used metaphorically to describe the manipulation or distortion of the scientific process as a way to reach a predetermined conclusion as dictated by an ideological bias, often related to social or political objectives. Okay, you're way ahead of me. Yes, of course, I was struck immediately by the read across to climate science. The parallels are remarkable. You may be familiar with the story of Lysenko. He was a Russian biologist and agronomist who rejected Darwinian evolution and the role of genes and preferred instead the Lamarckian concept of, quote, inheritance of acquired characteristics. Of course, that concept is difficult to accept, especially when you reflect that a man who has lost a leg is perfectly capable of fathering a child with 2 legs. With the benefit of hindsight, it is difficult to believe that Lamarckism was once regarded as a credible alternative to Darwinian theory, but so it was. And Lysenko in the late 20s took that view and built a whole theory of plant breeding on it. More than that, he had the ear of Stalin, and Lysenkoism became official Soviet doctrine. The theory was imposed rigidly. More than 3,000 mainstream biologists were fired or imprisoned or executed for challenging it. Lysenkoism held sway in the USSR until the 60s, with dire consequences for Soviet agriculture. Again, with hindsight, it is difficult to credit the fact that it survived so long when plainly it did not work. But worse than that, not only did it fail in the field, literally, but for decades it also totally blocked proper academic study and research in Russia in the area of plant breeding and Mendelian genetics. So how close are the parallels with climate theory? Of course, Lysenkoism was restricted to the USSR, and it was imposed by a totalitarian regime that could, and did, shoot dissenters. Climate alarmism, on the other hand, is broadly speaking global, even if some countries merely pay lip service to the orthodoxy. It is imposed not by a violent autocracy, but by an intolerant and often vindictive establishment, scientific, media, and political. It threatens not imprisonment and murder, but the destruction of careers. Scientists who dare to challenge the prevailing view are denied tenure and publication, and perhaps worst of all, they are denied grant funding. As a result, those who do dare to challenge the orthodoxy tend to be older scientists, secure in their careers and in their pension funds. In fact, the parallels with the Soviet Union go further. On the outer fringes of the warmism movement, we see demands for Nuremberg-style trials. Nor is it just scientists and company directors in the firing line. The BBC, for example, which is always achingly, painfully on message, seeks to exclude climate skeptics, and it famously dropped David Bellamy, who was once nearly as popular a presenter on nature and wildlife programs as Attenborough, merely because he dared to express doubts about global warming. We saw with the ClimateGate scandal how leading IPCC scientists engaged in, quote, the manipulation or distortion of the scientific process as a way to reach a predetermined conclusion as dictated by an ideological bias, just as Lysenkoism did. We see that their policies are utterly failing. Bjorn Lomborg famously demonstrated, for example, that all the hundreds of millions of dollars invested in solar panels by Germany would have the effect, on the IPCC's own estimates, of delaying the trajectory of global warming by only a few hours, and that not till the end of the century. An utter waste of money and resources. Now, of course, warmism has become a multi-billion-dollar industry, with money flooding in from governments, think tanks, academia, and the capital markets. The vested interests are huge. It is both comical and rather pathetic to hear green apologists still complaining about, quote, fossil fuel funding for climate denial, when any spending of that kind is utterly dwarfed by funding for the green blob. And just as Lysenkoism prevented Russian agronomy from doing the right things, so warmism, by focusing on mitigation, blinds us to the possible need for adaptation in the unlikely event that warming becomes a significant problem. Wealthy economies and societies are far more resilient to adverse conditions, but prosperity depends critically on the availability of secure and affordable energy, which mitigation and greenery militate against. Warmism prescribes vast upfront investment to guard against highly speculative and uncertain long-term outcomes. By the time you realize you're wrong, you've blown billions. Adaptation, on the other hand, is proportionate and involves spending money on targeted projects only as and when, and if, circumstances justify it. The main difference between Lysenkoism and warmism, as I see it, is that the damage done by warmism is on a far larger scale and will be far more difficult to reverse.